Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, SHERI HASAN of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on May 12th, 2023 from Contact Talk Radio. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. First, my usual housekeeping stuff, which is to tell you that you can listen to this podcast anytime by simply going to my website at karmicevolution.com and clicking on the upper right-hand portion of the banner labeled podcast. And from there, you can scroll down the page and hear the most recent show and or search the archived listings for past shows you might have missed or to which you'd like to listen again. And a reminder, the show drops now every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern. So again, you can listen then or you can listen anytime. And while you're at karmicevolution.com, you'll see above the most recently posted show a downloadable freebie entitled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy. This is friendly advice for every sun sign, regardless of which one, from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest, and it tells us what each of us, depending again on our individual sun sign, needs to be happy. This is based on an interview I did with Stephen a couple years ago, and he's given me permission to distribute it more widely as a means of promoting the validity of astrology in our lives. And yes, it will sign you up for my weekly Conversations About Consciousness astrology newsletter, but you can, of course, unsubscribe anytime. So be sure to grab that when you listen to this podcast, again, whether you do so live or after the fact, and enjoy some words of astrological wisdom. Separately, you can always follow me on my Facebook page, which is Karmic Evolution for Your Soul, where you can keep track of upcoming podcast content and other astro news you can use. I post now on Instagram as well under karmic.evolution, so feel free to follow me there too. Finally, I'm offering still my discounted 75-minute Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for $125 to radio show listeners only. So if you're interested in astrology, you want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart in order to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, and you'd like to move from chaos to clarity about what might be holding you back from achieving your most cherished desires in the areas of greatest interest to you. Might be your relationships, your career, your job, your finances, your health, whatever, then this is the reading for you. In this reading, we look at how the energies in which your soul chose to enter this lifetime may be keeping you stuck in old habitual patterns or what I call conditioned behavior, and how this knowledge, this growth in consciousness, can assist you to make different, more positive choices moving forward. So if you want to co-create your own future happiness through astrological insight about your own natal chart, that's easy when you take advantage of this specially discounted offer. And you can find it at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. As I like to say, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable. All right, so now let's get into this week's astro news you can use. I'd like to start this week's podcast off by saying one simple sentence, and that is that the tide is rising. I'm going to explain exactly what I mean based on the astrological symbolism of it shortly, but the bottom line is that this general energy is reflected back to us now by Saturn's current journey through watery Pisces. Before I go there, though, let's look back, as I'm often wont to do, to what's occurred in the past week and how we can correlate these occurrences to the planetary movements in the heavens. First, as most of us sky watchers know by now, the Scorpio moon opposed the Taurus sun and Uranus and Mercury retrograde at the Scorpio full moon lunar eclipse on May 5th, presaging the potential for rapid change to an old, outdated value system, or one that is no longer relevant to our current times. Next, Venus moved into Cancer and almost immediately quincunxed Pluto in Aquarius on May 7th, where she joined Mars, who was already transiting through this sensitive archetypal sign representing security, home, family, roots, tradition, memory, habit, and the past. Also on May 6th, there was that tragic mass shooting at an Allen, Texas outlet mall, quote, considered to be the second deadliest mass shooting of 2023, according to data from the Gun Violence Archive, according to NPR News. Of the 8 people killed, 3 were children, ages only 5, 8, and 11. CNN has since reported, quote, a family of 4 has become a family of 1 after a 6-year-old's parents and brother were fatally shot by a gunman at a Texas outlet mall Saturday, a GoFundMe post by the family's friends said. And, quote, the Houston office of the South Korean consulate confirmed Monday that 3 Korean Americans, husband Cho Kyu-sung, 37, and wife Kang Shin-young, 35, as well as one of their children, were killed in the shooting, according to the Dallas Morning News. That means, in terms of the archetypes, that the family, there's no family for some of this, or this 6-year-old to go home to now. Also on May 6th, the New York Times ran this story. This is a little topic shift, but I thought it was interesting. The headline reads, California panel calls for billions in reparations for black residents. A task force recommended that legislators enact a sweeping program to compensate for the economic harm from racism in the state's history. The task force's final report, which is to be sent to lawmakers in Sacramento before a July 1st deadline, includes projected restitution estimates calculated by several economists working with the task force. Now, interestingly enough, on the eve of Venus's entrance into Cancer, the New York Times printed this, and again I quote, one such estimate laid out in the report determined that to address the harms from redlining by banks, which disqualified people in black neighborhoods from taking out mortgages and owning homes, eligible black Californians should receive up to $148,099. And that estimate is based on a figure of $3,366 for each year they lived in California from the early 1930s to the late 1970s, when federal redlining was most prevalent. And likewise, the task force is looking at, quote, the impact of over-policing and mass incarceration. The report estimates each eligible person would receive $115,260, or about $2,352 for each year of residency in California from 1971 to 2020 during the decades-long war on drugs. In other words, being wrongfully removed from one's home and placed in a new one, a jail cell, during this period. Now, I didn't bring this up to specifically focus on the actual amount of reparations that this task force is recommending. I'm sure, should this ever come into reality, those numbers will change. However, it makes me think of when I used to report for the financial services industry back in the mid-1980s. That's when I learned what redlining was. And for those of you who don't know, that's when the banks take a map and draw a red line around the communities where a majority of minorities live. And then they do not make loans for them. So, this is related to slavery, but in a tangential way, right? It's what the task force, I'm sure, is looking at is modern day continuation of enslavement policies. Anyway, I go on. There's a lot to talk about today, so I don't want to belabor the point. I just wanted to explain a little more. Now, on May 7th, New York Times published this, again, the day that Venus moved into Venus moved into Cancer, and also as the Taurus sun was waxing towards its exact conjunction to Uranus on May 9th. So on May 7th, the New York Times published this, and I quote, the headline was, Ukrainians return home, renewed and resigned. More than 5.5 million people who left after the war began in February 2022 have gone back home, and not just to large cities like Kyiv and Dnipro, but to small places near the front line as well. The war is here. There is no safe place in Ukraine, so you might as well get on with it, said Dr. Natalia Medvedeva, a family doctor who tried living in a safer place in western Ukraine with her son, but came back here a few months later. And home is home, she said. And another quote, it's hard to describe what is so special about home, said Pavel Rudyev, an engineer at Pokrovsk's small train station. It's where everything is familiar, where you know people, where you have friends. Makes us think of the Friends sitcom song, right? When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, this principle didn't hold. More than 13 million Ukrainians, a third of the country, fled from their homes. But as time went on, it became harder to stay away. That's an end quote from this article. So all of this and more that I simply don't have time to include, but I will include the arrest of, quote, Pakistan's former cricket star and ousted Prime Minister Imran Khan, which happened also, it was reported on May 9th, and this is from the Times. Again, let me start again. The quote is, Pakistan's former cricket star and ousted Prime Minister Imran Khan, which intensified a showdown between the powerful Pakistani military and Mr. Khan and brought the country into uncharted political territory, according to the New York Times on May 9th. While Pakistani leaders have faced arrest before, never has anyone like Mr. Khan so directly and with mass popular support challenged the military. Remember, Venus in Cancer, Cancer ruled by the moon. Mundane astrology says the moon is the people. At the same time, Mars is in Cancer, and the people are fighting. And Pluto's in Aquarius, albeit he's retrograde now, but Aquarius is groups, right? So never has anyone, and with mass popular support, challenged the military in Pakistan, which for decades has been the invisible hand wielding power behind the government. That's an end quote, but I add this, and get this, Cancer represents family and home, right? I just read you some of the archetypal keywords for Cancer. Therefore, we often expand that to mean real estate in general. Your home is a piece of real estate. Whether you rent it or you buy it, doesn't really matter, right? And it's where we feel safe. So it's interesting that the Times wrote also, and here I quote, Mr. Khan was arrested in connection with a land transfer for a university, officials said, one of several corruption cases he's facing. I mean, his situation is probably a lot like Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, who has got several corruption cases against him too. But why do I even mention this? Well, again, from the Times, quote, the unrest offered a stark reminder of the turbulent political scene in Pakistan, a nuclear-armed nation of 230 million people that has struggled with instability and military coups since its founding 75 years ago. The military has ruled for over half of that history, and even under civilian governments, military leaders are seen as the force responsible for ushering political dynasties into and out of power. So that's an end quote, and I'm saying nuclear capable, did you say? As in capable of destroying homes in a flash, right? One country launches nuclear missiles, and depending on how far they can get, you're going to wipe out the homeland of certain percentage of a population. So, yeah, that. But, we haven't even gotten to the rest of what happened on May 9th yet when the Taurus sun perfected its square to Uranus, have we? So, everybody buckle up. We had, of course, huge surprises, including the extremely short 3.5-hour jury deliberation that found Donald Trump guilty of both sexual abuse and defamation on May 9th. It's interesting to note that this verdict was officially announced just a few minutes after 3 p.m. I've seen some astrologers online who really track this stuff are putting the exact time at about 3:08 p.m., which is less than an hour before the Taurus sun perfected its union with Uranus at 3:56 p.m., and this is Eastern time that day. So practiced astrologers usually come to learn that some aspects, as they wax or grow in strength, result in events occurring before the energy becomes exact. Likewise, we come to learn that some aspects, such as those involving Saturn, for example, can manifest after the aspects become exact. In Saturn's case, it's because Saturn represents and involves delay, meaning the results of a particular aspect by or to Saturn may reach consciousness after it's already occurred. An example of this is, a parent passes away and the person finds it difficult to grieve. 7 months later, their dog dies, and now they're inconsolable. We generally look at that from a psychological, astrological perspective as the actual death occurring at the Saturn transit, like, to or from, like if your mom passes, maybe Saturn's on your moon, opposing your moon, square your moon. It doesn't surface into true consciousness until another death occurs, and, that brings on the true grief. Now, Uranus, as an archetypal planet, and Aquarius as an archetypal sign, both representing rapid, unexpected change, often can shock us with sudden surprises at the exact or very close to exact time its aspects perfects, and such was clearly the case with the Trump trial verdict. So let's look at this first within an astrological context, or a broader astrological context, I should say. I've mentioned in the past that Chiron's entrance into Aries, signifying a wound to the ability to speak out or to speak one's truth without fear, occurred in April 2017, and that this coincided with the rise of the #MeToo movement. And this movement freed women as more and more felt comfortable speaking out, and as at the time Saturn transited Sagittarius until almost the end of that year, about the unjustness, Sagittarius ruled by Jupiter, ruled by moral ethics and justice, of sexual abuse. Let me put that sentence together without interrupting myself so you get the full import of it. The unjustness of sexual abuse at the hands of the powerful male patriarchy. Certainly many of us recall it was October 2017 when the New York Times and the New Yorker first reported that dozens of women had accused film producer Harvey Weinstein of rape, sexual assault, and sexual abuse over a period of at least 30 years. And this is from, I'm quoting now from Wikipedia. In fact, they say in Wikipedia, over 80 women in the film industry eventually accused Weinstein of such acts. End quote. Attitudes based on changing values began to morph after Uranus entered Taurus on April 17th of 2018, and it was July 6th of 2019 when Jeffrey Epstein was arrested, quote, by the FBI NYPD Crimes Against Children Task Force at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey on sex trafficking charges, and was jailed at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City, again according to Wikipedia. Now I reiterate, the May 5th Scorpio full moon lunar eclipse at 14 degrees and 48 minutes of Scorpio, which opposed the Taurus sun as it waxed toward its conjunction to Uranus, and just after having opposed Mercury retrograde in Taurus, promised a rapid change in collective values. That it took until the exact Taurus Sun-Uranus conjunction on May 9th should really come as no surprise to us. Hence, the proof that change is possible is based on the fact that what this civil trial verdict, this Trump trial verdict, highlights most is that it moves us in the direction away from male power, authority, and patriarchal control, and toward greater respect for the feminine divine. Let's remember that E. Jean Carroll filed her suit accusing Trump of defamation, but requested at that time no punitive damages, instead leaving it up to the jury to decide, even if this meant that she'd get nothing but the symbolic nature of a verdict in her favor. However, Carroll got both, a win for herself as a woman sexually assaulted, but when she had the audacity to announce her accuser was, I don't know what I wrote here, so hold on. When she had the audacity to, I guess, announce that she was accusing Trump, she was in turn accused of lying. So this case represents a win for all womankind, or read, all women in their millennia-long fight against patriarchal control through both sexual and financial abuse. My take on this? Well, here's how I sum it up. The Taurus Sun-Uranus conjunction on May 9th resulted in that's one small step for women and one giant step for womankind. And this sentiment was echoed by Carroll's post-verdict statement. Quote, I filed this lawsuit to clear my name and get my life back. This victory is not just for me, but for everyone who has suffered because she has not been believed. And, to not be believed is also to not be heard, and that's the Chiron in Aries in general. And her legal counsel, Roberta Kaplan, announced then too, quote, no one is above the law, not even a former president. For far too long, survivors of sexual assault faced a wall of doubt and intimidation. This is a victory not just for E. Jean Carroll herself, but for democracy. So, keep that in mind because it's part and parcel of what I'm going to go into later when I get to the specifics of why I say the tide is rising. If you're not catching on yet, which, fine if you don't. Also, on May 9th, Sun-Uranus conjunction, came the announcement of New York Congressman George Santos's indictment by the Department of Justice. However, we also knew that even after the exact Taurus Sun-Uranus conjunction on the 9th, there might be yet more shocks in store for us all, both collectively and, potentially personally. And that's because of the Aquarius moon's waxing square to Uranus, followed by the third quarter square of the Aquarius moon to the Taurus sun as part of the monthly lunar cycle that doesn't perfect until today, May 12th. So it was May 10th when the 13 federal Department of Justice count indictment of New York Congressman George Santos for wire fraud, public theft, money laundering, and making false statements was unsealed following his arraignment and arrest at a federal courthouse in Islip, Long Island, New York. Santos has proclaimed his innocence, refused to resign, and vowed to fight the charges as he remains serving in Congress, which apparently is legally allowed to do until his trial, which a lot of the legal pundits are saying will probably not occur for at least another year or so. Now, I point out, too, something many of you probably already know, is that George Santos also filed for unemployment benefits during the pandemic, even though he was making $55,000 a year and had other monies or whatever. That's not relevant, but I'm not going to go into that. You can find all of that in written reporting. It's all over it's been all over the news, right? So let's move on. Meanwhile, on May 9th, it was also the day when the president, Joe Biden, met with GOP House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, House Democratic Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell to help negotiate a deal to raise the U.S. debt ceiling before it runs out of money. Approval of Congress is needed to pay bills already incurred by the U.S. government and now owed. They need to be paid, presumably before June 1st, which is when Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has estimated it will all come due. I mean, it's May 11th, right? I won't go into more details. Again, you can find all this information in numerous different reputable places, except to note again that the tide is rising, and I'll get to that soon. President Biden also announced that he was sending 1,500 or authorizing the sending of 1,500 military troops to the border in El Paso, Texas on May 9th. That's due to the expiration of Title 42, enacted under the emergency pandemic decree by Donald Trump when he was president, and this is going to expire on May 11th, which was yesterday. Also, the pandemic, COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic emergency is officially over as of that date as well. And this is the date from which they're predicting, estimating, and assuming that millions will be thrown off of Medicaid benefits. Medicaid benefits had been automatically extended for nearly the 3 years of the pandemic without, strict scrutiny, because they didn't want, or the government didn't want anyone to be erroneously thrown off. And also on May 9th, Tucker Carlson, our favorite person, in his quest to find something to do after being fired by Fox, announced he would be starting a new show on Twitter. Again, details about this are easy enough to find, but I'd still point out that is June 22nd, 23rd, circa, when the transiting karmic nodes will reach 2 degrees Scorpio, the degree of the October 25th, 2022 Scorpio solar eclipse, which opposed Carlson's natal 10th house Saturn at 2 degrees and 4 minutes of Taurus, and it opposed that 10th house Saturn from his 4th house. My guess is that since the November 8th, and I don't think I said this last week, 16 degree 1 minute Taurus lunar eclipse fell on his 10th house cusp, which is 15 degrees 23 minutes of Taurus, and the April 20th, 2023 solar eclipse that just passed fell close to his 10th house 2 degree 4 minute Taurus Saturn, because that eclipse was at 29 degrees 50 minutes of Aries. And while the most recent May 5th Scorpio lunar eclipse at 1448 Scorpio conjoined his 4th house cusp, also at 1523, but in Scorpio, that he's got some serious contemplation to do about whether to go out there again or to stay home, at least for a while. Now, next fall, I noticed the solar eclipse falls at 21 degrees 8 minutes of Libra, again in his 4th house, while the October 28th 5 degree 9 minute Taurus lunar eclipse will be in his 10th house, again close to that 2 degree Taurus Saturn of his. So, as a side note, Saturn in the 10th often denotes that one may have been judged in past life karma. And since I don't think there's anyone who'd deny that Carlson is a judgmental human being, because of course we tend to internalize the energies that we were subjected to from external sources over time as we go through different lifetimes. And I say that I think most of us would agree that he's judgmental, regardless of whether he really feels that way deep down inside or not. It looks to me like karma has come around to bite him in the butt. But let's stay tuned, and we'll watch and wait to see if any additional just rewards are coming his way, perhaps in the form of a so diminished audience as to make him irrelevant. Now, speaking of irrelevant, there's also the May 10th CNN town hall disaster. There's plenty of reporting about this too, when CNN reporter Caitlin Collins let Donald Trump steamroller all over her. Like, what did she think he was going to do? Even at one point illustrating his usual MO of calling her nasty, leaving her seemingly unable to dispute his lies with factual facts. I just, invented a new term. Instead of alternative facts, I think I prefer factual facts. You with me, guys? Anyway, all this was as we were waxing into that moon Uranus, fixed moon Uranus, and third quarter monthly lunar square today, which is asking us to push through the recent eclipse's request for us to change our values, as I previously noted. Now, Saturn's in Pisces now, and it's only been there really for the past 2 months or so, but I think it's already illustrated something important. So now I'm going to go back to the rising tide comments I've made, previously. So why do I say that? Why do I call it the tide is rising? I mean, I have different headlines that I've played with. One is the tide is rising, and are we going to sink or swim? Are we going to float or are we going to sink? It's. I say that because I think of it this way. Saturn traditionally and archetypally represents lead, heavy, rock-like, immobile, unchangeable. Neptune-ruled Pisces, however, is, of course, usually related to water. I mean, sometimes it's gas too, or evaporated water and things like that. But what's the only thing that can wear away rock? Albeit, it takes a very long time. Well, yeah. It's Saturn. It's water. Water wears away rock. Think of a brook running over the stones. Eventually they're going to wear down the stones. I mean, it could take 1,000 years, but we said Saturn is slow, right? He's resistant to change. But think of Saturn, as we often do, as foundational security. Saturn represents the archetype of being able to feel secure. And such security usually derives from knowing we'll always have enough resources to survive. So Saturn relates to all things that provide us that secure foundation. First, our literal skeleton, the bones that hold us together so we can stand upright. They encase our flesh and blood and allow us to maintain our physical bodies. Next, it represents all things that make us feel safe, our literal home. Jobs for which we get compensated so that we can afford the things that sustain both our bodies and our careers, because the skeleton I mentioned, but the careers provide us with money so that we can pay for our rent or our mortgages, and we can buy food to keep our bodies functioning properly. We can, have those homes so that we're protected from the elements and the predators outside, etc., etc. So these are the things that the Saturnine part of each of us knows is essential to the successful sustenance of physical life, right? However, as just mentioned, Neptune-ruled Pisces, watery Pisces, dissolves. Pisces abhors boundaries, preferring collective energy to private boundaries of the ego. Pisces is transcendent, meditative and metaphysical, spiritual, among other things. It seeks to transcend Saturn's heavy ego resistance by flowing in order to penetrate Saturn's boundaries with, emotion. And the element of water's always representative of emotion, whether you're looking at Cancer, whether you're looking at Pisces, or you're looking at, what's the other... Cancer, and when I'm on a roll and I don't have this in front of me, Scorpio, of course. So, they're all watery. That's the water element, right? So the element of water is antithetical to Saturn because Saturn prefers facts. It prefers realism. It prefers that, thinking that what it can see is what it can believe in. While Neptune-ruled Pisces prefers mysticism and the notion that we don't have to see something to believe it, to put it, perfectly simply. So this past week, we were asked whether what we thought we valued previously is still what we value now. The Sun Uranus was the spark leading up to it and since to get us to realize that we can question our old values. For example, do we still value a Supreme Court that's comprised of a majority of those who hubristically think they can interpret the U.S. Constitution from an originalist point of view, when so many of today's legal dilemmas involve issues around social mores? I mean, are we looking at the Constitution from the social mores of the late 1700s and the early 1800s, and even, amendments that were added since, which are now becoming, if not archaic, just aging? Do on another topic, do 3%, this relates to the mass shooting, the last mass shooting. I mean, do 3% of gun owners own 70% of guns in America? Have 13,900 people, both children and adults, died thus far as victims of gun violence in America? Do 80% of Texans support background checks and raising the legal age to buy an AR-15 rifle to 21 and more? And are women content to sit around like the good women of yore, like when the Constitution was written, and ignore the dissolution of their hard-fought and hard-earned rights to bodily autonomy, among other things like the right to vote? And should we put a check and balance on corruption, be it outside or inside our court system? And are our elected officials simply out of touch? The ones who approve our judges in the legal system? Are they removed from the lives of the average American, deaf to the majority's wishes on these issues? Or do they sit above it all, seemingly oblivious to the problems and issues, pains and losses of the average person and his or her family? Are our collective values broken or simply being ignored? Is Saturn in Pisces the island in the middle of the ocean as the tide is slowly rising? That's the image that came into my mind recently, rapidly followed by a medieval castle surrounded by water, or, the stereotypical moat. And then I remembered that it's not the water that keeps people from approaching the castle, should anyone want to attempt to gain entrance and harm its inhabitants. It's what's in the water, the alligators. So if we follow this metaphor for Saturn and Pisces, we can begin to feel what it's like when the ego is pushed to the point where it needs boundaries in order to prevent it from drowning. And drowning, particularly in the area of romantic poetry from the late 1700s and the early 1800s, which is a period, it is the period during and following the American Revolution, represents madness. Now, we also know that water, again, represents emotions, and Saturn represents rational, empirical, earthbound logic. Saturn's positives are many, and without this archetypal energy, we'd never be able to build any kind of foundation upon which we could rely for our basic security. The ones that I've mentioned, be they for a house, a family, a career, or what have you, or just the maintenance of our physical bodies. Saturn is success-oriented and smart enough to know that one needs to establish a firm foundation on which to continually build towards success. However, it's when Saturn's archetypal nature refuses to bend, when its rigidity ceases to allow us to expand our foundations and instead stymies our future progress, that we lose our flexibility. And rigidity leads to stasis, and stagnation to eventual rot, and rot leads eventually to extinction. So think about it. Saturn can represent the dams that protect our farms and our homes, our hospitals and schools from flooding, which would otherwise render them unusable. But Saturn can also represent the unnecessary habit of erecting barriers that block out potentially beneficial intuitions and emotions. So if Saturn inhibits water's ability to flow when he's passing through Neptune-ruled Pisces, he dams up the works. And we hear platitudes like thoughts and prayers at someone's death rather than an effort to truly solve the problem behind the cause of that death. Now, the tide's been rising against Saturn's emotional fortifications at least since he squared Neptune in Pisces while transiting through Sagittarius back during 2015 and 16. And all inclusivity is Jupiter's archetypal realm, And simply put, Saturn's transit through that sign manifested as attempts to limit that inclusivity. It's no wonder then that one of the most used phrases during that 2016, 15, and 16 presidential election cycle, and once the contest was decided, that one of the most used phrases was "build the wall." So politically speaking, this was a period that can be traced to the beginning of a rise in authoritarianism, not only abroad, but right here in America, starting with the presidential election of 2016. Now, I want to go back to the post-Sun Uranus as we've approached today. It was announced on May 10th also that California Senator Dianne Feinstein is due to return to the Senate and take up her place in the Senate Judiciary Committee, where she shifts the majority vote to the ability to subpoena Supreme Court Chief Justice Roberts or Supreme Court Clarence Thomas or billionaire Harlan Crow, as well as approving committee's nomination of Democratic judges to go forward for full Senate approval. She's been gone. She's missed 91 votes in the Senate in general, and I think she's been gone for almost 3 months. So, there's been a lot of talk about whether or not she should step down, and I'll leave that up to you to decide, but she is 89 years old, and she's not running for re-election. She's been out for so long, she's had shingles. I feel terrible for her, but it's time to go because she's reenacting the playbook of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who refused to step down as the Supreme Court Justice during Obama's term, and that's what got us into trouble and led to 3 Supreme Court right-wing justices' approval during the Trump administration. So now things may settle down for this weekend, and we may rest a bit to sharpen our swords during this waning portion of the monthly lunar cycle, which would pass through today. So today, May 12th, so that we maintain stability and commitment within our relationships. And this will occur, I believe, when Mercury sextiles Venus and Venus trines Saturn. It's, Mercury retrograde in Taurus, sextiling Venus in Cancer, and Venus in Cancer forming a watery trine to Saturn in Pisces on May 12th and 13th, respectively. And, what we know is that communication will once again begin to flow freely when Mercury stations direct in Taurus on May 14th at 5 degrees and 51 minutes of Taurus, just in time for Mother's Day. Which is a good thing because Mars is waxing into an exact trine to Neptune by May 15th, and we may be more tuned into other people's needs than our own at that time. All of this is food for thought and something to watch for as the big news next week becomes Jupiter's entrance into earthy, serene, dependable Taurus, where he will remain for approximately the next year until May of 2024, but Jupiter enters Taurus now on May 16th. So the question becomes, does this expand Taurus's earthy qualities, or, the positive ones, right? Dependability, calmness, serenity, loyalty, it's a fixed sign, physicality, the senses, the pleasures, the being at one with nature? Or does it increase its less desirable ones of stubbornness and resistance to change? So as always, time will tell as Jupiter remains in Taurus again until May 2024, though we may get a taste of the Taurian stubbornness first when he squares Pluto in fixed ideological Aquarius May 17th. And that's because this can ignite our ambition for power, which in turn can provoke others to oppose us. Now, this might not bode well for the financial debt ceiling discussion, but, I think that there is hope in the short term that today's May 12th meeting between these negotiators, the same ones I mentioned, including President Biden, may ultimately lead to making major headway during the stability of these weekend transits. So, it's going to be interesting to see whether or not there'll be, I don't know, Jupiter in Taurus can be overly optimistic, but it can also expand all the good things, right? So, Jupiter is in traditional astrology the great benefic, and Venus is known as the lesser benefic. So I want to mention, too, that although I've been focused mainly on Saturn being a Neptune-ruled Pisces, that there was a time, and this is from traditional astrology, long before Neptune was discovered in the 1850s, that Jupiter was the ruler of Pisces. So Jupiter, the great benefic, enters the Venus-ruled sign of Taurus, and Venus is known traditionally as the lesser benefic, as I said, and we have a recipe for potential generosity. But again, we have a recipe, too, for over-optimism that makes us, I mentioned this last week when I talked about Kevin McCarthy's chart and his natal Jupiter, which took that 16 Taurus eclipse. Was it last year? Yeah, the November 8th eclipse at 1601. He has, I think it was a 16 Taurus, but if not, it was conjoined to his 12th house Taurus, which opposed his Neptune in Scorpio, right? So he's a happy-go-lucky, overly optimistic kind of guy, which I think you have to be to pursue your speakership for 15 different votes. However, as Jupiter approaches his entrance into Taurus, I'm going to quote something I heard of a more positive nature. Cornell Belcher, who is a Democratic pollster, I'm going to quote from something he said on MSNBC this past week, right after the Trump trial jury's conclusion, which is that we all should have, quote, faith that in the end, the majority of Americans will do the right thing. He was talking specifically about the jury making the right decisions. And when they asked him, someone asked him, how do we not underestimate Trump again? Belcher said, have a conversation with the American people. Trump won't reach the majority. And this hails back to the CNN town hall that he led on Wednesday night, because basically he just lied through the whole thing. He kept talking. He, as I said, he didn't stop. He just, he was himself. He was the same guy that he's always been. So he says Trump won't reach the majority. He was a fluke as a president because of the electoral system. The majority of Americans are not for Trump, are not going to be for Trump. We'll be told how old and decrepit Biden is, and then third-party candidates will come in and Trump will win. This is something that Belcher warned about, and he advised everyone to stay woke. Now, I know that from personal experience because my son voted for a third-party candidate in 2016. Fortunately, he was older and wiser by the time the 2020 election occurred. Mama didn't raise no fool. But, he had a little bit of the idealistic crap beat out of him, all right? But, started to look at the situation realistically, and again, from the eyes of someone who was 4 years older. But, there's a lot here that we need to reevaluate in terms of what it is we truly value, which I've said already. And that is that, we're seeing things change. How long do we hold on to our resistance to change? I've said this numerous times over the past couple of podcasts. Change is inevitable. Change is the only constant. I come from New York, and I lived through the Reagan years in my early 20s, and I still meet people my age and a little older and even up to 10 years younger whose parents were Reagan Democrats, and they still talk about his policies as though he saved the world when he led to so many horrible things. Think about the influx of immigrants at the Texas border. I keep thinking, and I don't have the specifics enough, so I'm not going to quote them, but, when Reagan, Iran-Contra crisis, right, when he was trading guns for cocaine or the CIA was involved, you can look all that stuff up. But a lot of the stuff that America supported or did or helped to overthrow democratically elected officials in Latin American countries in particular led to these worsening crises in the countries that caused people to want to flee and come into America now. So the crisis is in large part not only, of course, but it does bear that America look at its actions and actually acknowledge the part that they've played in some of the crises that they like to cry about in Congress now. The other thing is, I just heard someone say today or yesterday that we haven't passed any serious legislation regarding immigration in Congress since 1986. And the other thing that I think the rising tide will prove to affect is the 2024 presidential election, because the tide is rising where people are tired. Now, a lot of the polling is saying that, Biden is so far down. I'm not going to get into it because it will take me too long and I'll just go on and on and on, and I'm out of time almost. But the media has a lot to do with that. And, I may talk again next week about this CNN town hall with Trump, which was packed with Trump sycophants that were reportedly chosen by the CNN studio people. And that, they're not showing us the real deal and, making it appear to the rest of the country, for anyone who paid any attention to it, as something that it was not. In other words, that the appearance was of this adoring fan base clapping and cheering when Trump lied upon lie upon lie. And by the way, a lot of people are now saying after being fined $5 million in part for defaming E. Jean Carroll, he defamed her again at the CNN town hall. So talk about not learning your lesson. But anyone who doesn't know that about Trump by now is, I guess I'll be kind and say not a critical thinker. He also went back to his harping on, I watched part of it. I was curious. It was a morbid curiosity. I wanted to see for myself, but I couldn't stick out the whole thing, so I probably watched it for about 40 minutes. But he, again, harped on the European countries not spending enough money, whether through NATO or otherwise, to support the Ukrainians and letting the major financial burden fall to the United States. We know that Joe Biden has patched up a lot of the relationships that Trump marred with the NATO countries and allies during his administration. So, again, we can be wary of where our values stand. I think in terms of how we feel Congress has been so inept and ineffective through its polarization and lack of bipartisanship, and hope that perhaps Jupiter in Taurus will put forth a little bit more generosity and optimism for not just us watching them, but for them to provide a reason for us to be optimistic. So as the tide rises and Pluto begins to retrograde, it's already retrograde, but when he retrogrades back into Capricorn on June 11th, we want to be careful, or we want to observe how those of a Saturnine nature will become more Saturnian, more resistant, more rigid, etc. And, the more that happens, again, over the next year and a half, because Pluto will retrograde twice into Capricorn between now and November of 2024, past the election, how much of that is going to affect, well, let's say how much of that is going to highlight that those who resist change represent the old guard and not the youth, the progressiveness of humanity toward future betterment, of our lives, etc., etc. Okay, so I'll get off my soapbox now. And the only one thing I wanted to say too is that a lot of these changes, I think, and it goes starting with the E. Jean Carroll sexual abuse verdict, which, and I mentioned this last week too, it includes, male aggression against females, but also males against males, and to a lesser degree, females against males. So it's not just for females, it's for everyone, right? But that this kind of verdict creates, they're talking all about it, I'm sure you've heard it by now, there is no such thing as a perfect rape victim, right? So the fact that the jury of your peers can find someone guilty for having sexually abused you because the jury believes your side of the story, as I said with E. Jean Carroll's quotes and her lawyer's quotes, it bodes well as Pluto enters Aquarius for the long term, for our pursuing a path of equality for all human beings, regardless of their outward appearance, their gender, their race, their color, all, the whole Megillah. And as people become more comfortable with this, and I heard someone say on the news, and I thought it was really interesting, that it's been noted, I guess through polls and things like that, or studies done, that people with friends or relatives of someone who is gay or lesbian, and we're talking about going back 20 or 30 years, are those who also support the transgender population now. And so that this proves that familiarity, rather than breeding contempt, can actually give us the ability to understand that all people are people, regardless of what they look like, sound like, what religion they follow, what country they come from, etc., etc. All right. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining me today. I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please be sure to join me next week on May 19th for another episode of Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book.